had to get my own stand, but it's here. Somebody else got it. Okay. I know, that's why I was in the wrong door. I thought I had to grab this and bring it out. Yeah, I may have to get everything back to normal. Alrighty. Let's get ourselves cranking here. Okay. Who remembers where I left off and what was the last thing I said so I know where to start? We'll get there. But anyway, let's review. Usually we skip the begats because we just don't understand them and we can't pronounce all those funny names. But there are a few things in there that are kind of interesting if we let the scholars reveal it to us with their study. But Von Rad points out that the story here, after the flood is basically saying that there are going to be three main families, and we see that in that it's trying to lay out the three geographical areas of where the neighbors are, and that's kind of the extent of the world of the biblical writers at that time, and who all those people are. But there was an original story that had Shem, Japheth, and Canaan, and that story of primeval origins. However, another story of Noah and his sons on the ark had Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So the story tries to harmonize the names by making Ham the father of Canaan and bringing the two stories together. And he notes that on the ark, Shem, Ham, and Japheth are married with wives, but in the text afterwards, they're still living as boys or as very young men in the tent of their father Noah. Ham is listed as a middle child, and then it says he's the youngest. And then it says, when Noah was born, a note that he would overcome the curse of the earth and bring comfort. Lamech, his father says, when Noah is born, out of the ground which the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands. So the story goes on, and then we have the flood, and then we have him coming off the ark, and then he tills the soil, he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk. However, drunkenness was not a huge moral issue at that time. And in the different verses will express wine is to gladden the heart. So he cultivates grapes and he brings comfort. That the wine is a comfort to people. It's some people are prescribed a glass of wine instead of a tranquilizer in the evening to de-stress from our stressful life now. So getting drunk is not a moral issue for the biblical writers, but Noah was the first to discover the alcohol, and in one way, and then so in one sense that's picked up on one of those etiologies. Where did something come from? What was the first time, as it's dealing with beginnings? What began something? But then we get in that his nakedness is exposed, and then when he wakes up, he finds out what his youngest son Canaan had done instead of Ham, and so there's this big curse. Cursed be Canaan. And I was finding in Vaughters' work, his commentary, an interesting note that I thought would be good for us to have before we leave all of this and move on. He says, the real point of this story is reached in verse 24 and the following. When Noah woke up from his drunkenness and learned what his youngest son Canaan had done to him, he pronounced blessings and cursings, which were, in the Yahweh's perspective, prophetic of the diverse peoples that then existed in the world. Cursed be Canaan. And we say again, Canaan is conceived of as the eponymous. Y'all know that word, eponymous? It's spelled E-P-O-N-Y-M-O-U-S. Eponymous. It's the word that means the founding ancestor, or the founding person who gives name to folks. And we have that all over the Bible, and particularly in these genealogies. So there's a word for that, eponymous. I had to look it up. I better go get my dictionary to be sure, but I think it's eponymous, E-P-O-N, epon, I-Y, mus, M-O-U-S, eponymous, ancestor of the Canaanites. So anyway, the aboriginal or indigenous population of Palestine was displaced by the Israelites in an understanding of the history. It's probably intended to be less an evocation of ancient relationships than it is a continuing warning to Israel to hold its religious traditions and despise the vile and contaminating of the contrary influences which were proffered to it daily by the heathen people of the land who continued to live there in their midst. From the earliest of Israelite prophets, whose names have been preserved in the literature of the Bible, Hosea, for example, down to the legislation that took its form in Israel's last days as an independent people with its own cult and religion and temple and so forth that we find in the Deuteronomic catalogs, the Israelites had to be bullied, cajoled, and force-fed to protect them against the abominations of the Gentiles, which tempted them on every side. After all, Canaan represented the old religion which had stood the test of unknown centuries long before Israel was heard of and had preserved the bountiful land which it had inherited. So, the religion of Canaan and the Canaanites were really flesh of their flesh and bone of their bone of the Israelites. It tugged at Israel just as surely as the religion of the Roman paganism tugged at the nascent and interloping Christian faith in the 3rd and 4th centuries, or the witchcraft and covens and curious rites tugged at Christendom in the Middle Ages. And often the old religion never really surrendered, but as in the case of many Christian traditions, became assimilated and absorbed by the new faith, which only half-hearted gesture to reinterpret. Now, we still have some of that. We've got Halloween coming up. We've got all of that fear of death and the dying of plants and animals and stuff in the fall when the hard winters come. And so it's kind of a fearful thing. And so cultures deal with their fears with different ways of confronting them and so forth. But the Christians tried to baptize all of that pagan stuff in Halloween by having All Saints' Day. All Hallows Eve or All Saints' Day. But there was the the pagan fear of death and not knowing how to really handle that. And then Christmas time. We've got lots of customs at Christmas time that have nothing to do with the baby Jesus, but they were inherited from the pagan cultures and the this winter solstice time that happens, and so we kind of baptized a lot of those customs and tried to make them Christian. But anyway, so much of Christmas time in our culture, there's lots of non-believers and non-churchgoers that are just into Christmas, and they decorate their houses, and they've got Santa Clauses and baby Jesuses and all kinds of stuff that it's just all over the place, and it's commercialism wants to sell this stuff. And so anyway, it brightens things up and makes people happy. So we don't condemn it, but it does present a problem for interpreting our faith to the unchurched. What is our faith and what is a cultural thing that has been baptized pagan something or other that has found its way into the church and so forth. Anyway, that's one of the reasons we try not to confuse the kids by having Santa Claus show up at Sunday school on Christmas Sunday. Kind of let the culture have Santa Claus, and let's try to keep reminding the kids and help them really learn what our faith is about with the baby Jesus. And anyway, so this was true and still happening way back thousands of years ago in the early times with the writers here trying to get this distinction between the pagan cults and influences surrounding them that were trying to lead them astray. I think we still have some of those things in our culture trying to lead us astray. Have any of you seen the advertisements for the casinos? Yahoo! It's the most happy, fun time and fun place you can go. I don't know how many of I've told you. There's a town called Deadwood, South Dakota. Karen and I, when we were first married, we went on a trip and went north and went through the Badlands of North Dakota and saw Mount Rushmore and then over to Yellowstone and Teton. And it was really a nice trip, but we went through Deadwood. And then when Bobby was about 9, we thought, let's redo that trip. Well, when we went through Deadwood the first time, it was an old historic town. And it had a lot of culture that was related to history. The second time we went, it had been taken over by the gambling industry, and every old hotel and lobby did not have, nice restaurant and historic stuff. They were full of slot machines. And we could not find a restaurant or place to eat that did not have the gambling and the bar that we could go in with a minor. The only place we could find was a pizza parlor in the basement underneath one of these things, in the downtown area. And, the commercials for the gambling, it just wonderful lights and happy times and, you meet your friends and, we've made it to heaven. This is the ultimate. This is wonderful in the commercials. What I saw looking in the windows, no offense to us with gray hair, but older people, senior adults, sitting on a stool, smoking a cigarette at the slot machine. 2 or 3 in each establishment that had 40 or 50 slot machines. It was so sad. It was so sad. Wasn't the happy time, wasn't friends, wasn't fulfillment, wasn't joy, wasn't relationships. It was bad. It was bad. Anyway, that's just the way I saw it. And it was disappointing too. And the pizza wasn't much good either. But anyway, but there are, these attractions around that the culture is saying, come on in, this is wonderful. This is great. And the tradition of our faith is saying, no, it's not. It's not good for you. It's not healthy. We've got something better. Come over here and be over here with us. Anyway, so the curse on Canaan is really a way of saying that culture, those people, those influences are not good. Avoid them. Do not get entangled in that sort of thing. Now, in order to get over to Tower of Babel, we've got to get through some of these names and what they're telling us, because between Noah getting off the boat and getting to Abram and Sarai, we've got a lot of verses going on, and these are trying to tell us something about the Hebrew people and their special relationship with God. So, chapter 10, verse 1, after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So they're still having long lives, but the lives start getting shorter as we move through. These are the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Children were born to them after the flood. And then it reverses the order and starts with the descendants of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. If I mispronounce these, make a note and you can give me a list and I'll try to get it right. The descendants of Gomer, Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togar, Ma, and descendants of Javan, and Elijah, and Tarshish, and Kittim, and Rodim. And you notice some of these will sound like towns or place names that will be familiar, but from these the coastland people spread, and these were the descendants from Japheth, in their lands with their own language, by their families, in their nations. Now, it's saying nations instead of tribes, so this is looking at, big groups of people who are fulfilling God's command to go and fill the earth after the flood. Now the descendants of Ham: Cush, Egypt, Put, Canaan. The descendants of Cush: Sheba, Havilah, Sabbathah, Ramah, Sabtecta. The descendants of Ramah, Sheba, and Denan. Cush became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Anyway, that seems odd when you start listing just names, but there are several interesting things. I think this might really be tied to a historical person who is being remembered, someone who is powerful, and it may have been a very mean and ruthless tyrant, and so We're not sure, but there are lots and lots of speculations about who Nimrod might have been. Anyway, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, and Akkad, and all of them in the land of Shinar, which later will be equated with Egypt, I think. From that land, he went into Assyria, and then, over into Syria, and built Nineveh, Rehobothar, and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. Egypt, in the line of Egypt. Egypt became the father of Ludum, Anam, Lehabim, and Neptuhim, and Pathruzim, and Cashulim, and Kephontorim, from which the Philistines came. Canaan became the father of Sidon, the firstborn, and Heth, and Jebusites, and Amorites, and Girgashites, and Hivites, and Archites, and Sinites, and Abardites, and Semarites, and the Hamarathites, and afterwards the families of the Canaanites spread abroad. And the territory of the Canaanites extended from Sidon in the direction of Gerar as far as Gaza. Anybody heard of Gaza? And in the direction of Sodom and Gomorrah and Adam and Zeboim as far as Lasha. These are the descendants of Ham by their families, their languages, and their lands and their nations. So we've got two of them covered. Now to Shem, also the father of all the children of Eber. And they think Eber is the one who is the descendants of Eber, Hebrew, those folks. The elder brother of Japheth. Children were born, the descendants of Shem, Elam, Asher, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. The descendants of Aram, Uz, Hul, Gether, Mash, Arpachshad, became the father of Shelah, and Shelah became the father of Eber, and to Eber were born two sons, the name of Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan, and Joktan became the father of Almodad, and Sheleph, Hazamavareth, Jerah, and Hadoram, and Uzal, and Dilkah, and Ubal, and Imael, and Sheba, and Ophir, Havilah, that's a familiar name, and Jobab. All these were the descendants of Joktan. The territory in which they lived extended from Mesa in the direction of Sephar, the hill country, to the east. These are the descendants of Shem by their families, their languages, it's plural, their lands and their nations. These are the families of Noah's sons, according to their genealogies in their nations, and from the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. That summary statement is kind of the point of all of that. It is saying that God said, go and be fruitful and bless them, and so they went and they were fruitful. They were very fruitful. They made all of these, not just tribes wandering around in their tents in the Middle East, but nations, powerful nations, the names of which and the power of which those who are hearing this in an oral telling would click, 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 click. I know, I've heard of them, 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 I've heard of them. And so, it's a big deal, but it is a way of saying that God's Word, God's orders or command of what God willed was fulfilled. They went out and they filled the earth, and made all of these nations. And these different languages and so forth. Now, we have a little contrast. In the 11th chapter, now the whole earth had one language. They just told us all of these nations and that had their own languages, and now it jumps back. But it's not trying to contradict or undo it. It's just picking up another story and inserting it in the midst of these genealogies to be an etiology. We find out we had Noah and his sons. For them to get along, they must have been able to talk to each other and had one language that they shared. And then, but it was from them that all of these tribes and nations and countries and empires evolved. How come from their one language to now everybody's got a different language? The etiology, here's what we have now. Where did it come from? Well, let me tell you a story. Where did it come from? Well, that's an etiology, a story that explains how did we get to here? Where did it come from? And so that's why this is inserted in here, we believe. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words as they were migrated from the east, and they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Now this is kind of interesting. We think primitive tent dwellers. How do they know about bricks and mortar and bitumen and so forth? Anyway, and then they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth, whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the mortals had built. And the Lord said, Look, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. The implication is God's not really liking what it looks like they're about to do. And so, come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Now just briefly, before I go on, because we got the whole story we want to capture in this one reading. The command, go, multiply, fill the earth, they're in the process, early in the process, and they stop. They build a city, and they want to build a tower to the heavens in order to get up and be equal to and the same level with God. And so they are being disobedient. God's command is spread out over the earth and fill the earth, but yet they want to stop and disobey. They don't want to do that. And so God has to make them not able to understand each other, so they can't cooperate and continue to build the city and thereby not fill the earth, not spread out and frustrate or thwart God's will as expressed early, go and fill the earth, multiply, and so forth. So, God has to confuse their language to upset that process of working together to build this city in order to fulfill God's command and will. So, That's one basic understanding, but there's all kinds of other things that we can come back and look at that are in the story as well. So these are the descendants of Shem. So it goes back and repeats after that to remind us, the descendants of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Ashpashad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after the birth of Arpachshad 500 years and had other sons and daughters. And when Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah. And Ashpashad lived after the birth of Shelah 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he became the father of Eber. And Shelah lived after the birth of Eber 403 years and had other sons and daughters. And when Eber had lived 34 years, and he became the father of Peleg, and Eber lived after the birth of Peleg 430 years and had other sons and daughters. And when Peleg lived 30 years, he became the father of Reu, and Peleg lived after the birth of Reu 209 years. See, then 300, now 200, had other sons and daughters. And when Reu lived 32 years, he became the father of Serug. And Reu lived after the birth of Serug 207 years and had other sons and daughters. And when Serug had lived 30 years, he became the father of Nahor. And Serug lived after the birth of Nahor 200 years. 207, 203. He had other sons and daughters, and when Nahor had lived 29 years, and they're starting to have babies earlier too, 35, 32, 29. And Nahor lived after the birth of Terah 119 years. It's almost getting back to now. Terah had other sons and daughters. Now Terah had lived when he had lived 70 years. Now he's waiting a while. He lived 70 years. He became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the descendants of Terah. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran was the father of Lot. Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Any of this sounding familiar? Now we're getting close to that crossover from primeval history to, even though very ancient and not real precise, but we're getting to the point of the story of the Hebrew people and real human beings involved in real history. Abram and Nahor took wives, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, in case you didn't catch it the first time. And they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. Now the intention is to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, interesting, that's the same word as his son's name, but they came to a land of Haran and they settled there. They stopped. They didn't go farther. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Is that familiar? So we're getting to this, one of the most important verses of the Hebrew Bible. This call upon Abram to go. But before we get there, all of this other stuff that we've just been going over, it was leading up to it, and there were some ways that we need to understand some of these things. And let's see where I am. I think in Vater, okay, it's saying, as I said off the cuff, it's to show the fulfillment of the divine blessing on the new creation of man emerged after the flood, that it should be fertile and multiply and fill the earth. And preeminently, this design of God toward man were to be made manifest in history of divine grace and promise and election. We're getting ready for the election. In order to have the Hebrew people elected and being special, if they're the only people, then there's no specialness of election. But out of all of these nations and tribes and so forth, why does God choose this people? And that's part of the reason they had to go through all of those descendants and generations, is to give us a sense of how big all of that was, and also to get a sense of that location geographically where these people had been scattered. But anyway, it becomes quite evident that the common denominator of these peoples, Africans on the one hand and Asiatics on the other, is not their ethnic relationship, but rather their historical encounter with Israel. All of them were remembered as enemies and oppressors at one time. And within that, it's also a way of bringing the Hebrew people together, because when we get the sons and all of the tribes, they really probably weren't direct line and tight genealogy, but rather groups of people who had to be brought together by weaving these generations together, that even though you think you're strangers to one another, really, if we go back far enough, we're related. We're kinfolk. And that's the way, so you guys stop fighting with each other and get along, because we need to have unity as the people of God. So that's part of the point of all of this. But I found this interesting in Vater. He said, there's an insertion from the J source which differs from content from the surrounding priestly context. It takes up various descendants of Cush and Merizim and Canaan, omitting put. Anyway, it's inserted material we see perhaps better than before the kind of historical and national presuppositions that lie behind these genealogies, both in P and J. It is as though we were to record our own history in this fashion. The descendants of Europe, Britain, France, and Spain. Britain became the father of America, Canada. To Spain also children were born. California, Mexico, The descendants of America: Virginia, Georgia, Carolina. Georgia became the father of Atlanta, Augusta, and Savannah, and so forth. That make a little more sense and give us a feel for what the role of these genealogies were playing to try to help them see where these people came from, and when we go back far enough, realize, hey, we're all cousins. We're one people. Anyway, it gets back. Let's see. At any rate, it was worthy of some note that in this final portion, the genealogy of the sons of Noah, many, not all, of the Yahwist's names are intended to indicate individual persons, real or not, whereas most, but not all, of the priestly authors' names indicate peoples or places. In particular, the name Eber, Hebrew, Heber, adjective Hybri, is undoubtedly intended to designate the eponymous ancestor of the Hebrews. Hebrew, as we shall see later, was possibly a social before it was an ethnic term. What that means is it's kind of a word that means servants or slaves, and anyway, it later took on an ethnic aspect. Okay, there are those. Oh, and I happen to I'm not real good with geography. I really have to go to a globe or a map in order to remind myself with common names of places like all the African nations, and look it up again and say, well, is that East Africa or West Africa? Or is that in the middle, or is it in the north or the south? In order to remind myself. And I collect books that might be of help to me sometime. I had someone come to my office once and looked at all of my books, and they asked, oh my gosh, you have so many books. Have you read all of those? And my answer was, some of them I've read twice. A whole bunch I've never read because of different reasons. This I don't remember, but this one's old and was given to Harry on Christmas of 1947 from Clarabelle. And signed Mary Helen Niemeyer. Anybody know Mary Helen Niemeyer? Well, at some point, somebody had, probably one of the funerals I did, they had a big pile of books that they had in the house, and they said, these are a bunch of religious books and Bible studies, and do you need any of those? And I picked this one up because within it, it's got a map, and in this map it says, the world of the patriarchs, circa 2000 to 1700 BC. And it's the Hebrew Table of Nations from Genesis 10. So it's got a lot of these names and territories of where the different peoples were. We got Cush and Egypt and so forth, and Babylonia. Basically creating a map that would try to lay out where all of these people being named actually happened to be. And if I had the technological skills to do PowerPoint, I would have reproduced that and had a screen and clicked it, and you could have seen it. Or I could have tried to photocopy it. That's probably expired. But Anyway, I have it if anybody wants to come look after class and kind of look at these things. The publisher of this, you think you might have it at home? It says Westminster Aids to Study of the Scriptures, and Westminster Press, published in 1945. And anyway, it's kind of old, but it's history that's thousands of years old, so there probably hadn't been a whole lot of change. But anyway, there are lots of Bible atlases, and some of your study Bibles will have times and little maps that will say this was the map at a certain period of time, and this was the map at a different period of time. The land masses haven't changed, just where they draw the borders and put the names of who they are. Let's see. One of the things was saying when we get to the Tower of Babel that a lot of people will interpret that was the towers that were being built in Babylon, but in our one of the commentators had said he didn't think so, because the towers that they're referring to were of the 6th or 7th centuries, but that this was written and the sources had to come from 10,000 years before. So it would have been over 3 centuries before when this was being pulled together, and then the sources would have been earlier than that. So they couldn't have really seen those towers of the ziggurats that were later. And he argues that it is a borrowing of literary, and so let's see, I've got to find the right page. Okay. In the Epic of Creation from the Imuna Elish, it has the gods, and Marduk wants to relieve all the other gods of their labor, and so he decides to make people to be the slaves of the god, and that he will create mankind from the blood and impose the toil of the gods on man and release the gods from it. And when Ea, the wise, had created mankind, he imposed the toil of the gods on them, and the deed is impossible to describe. And then in order for the gods, they want to thank Marduk for doing this, and so they want to come. They address Marduk, their Lord. Now, Lord, that you have set us free, we are our favors, gotten the favors from you. We would like to make a shrine with its own name. We would like our night's resting place to be in your private quarters and to rest there. Let us found a shrine, a sanctuary there. And whenever we arrive, let us rest within it. And when Marduk heard this, his face lit up greatly like daylight. Create Babylon, whose construction you requested. Let its mud bricks be molded, and build high the shrine. And then Anakai began shoveling. For a whole year they made bricks for it. And when the second year arrived, they had raised the top of Esagila in front of it, the Apsu, and they built a high ziggurat for the Apsu. And so they're thinking it was this literary thing from the Epic of Gilgamesh that inspired the creator of this story of the Tower of Babel, dealing with the arrogance of thinking that someone could build something for the gods and that the gods would dwell there. It was kind of like all the gods wanted to have a sleepover at Marduk's house, and so he was really happy to go about building this because he was the chief or head god. But this image of the ziggurat and building a city, and then we know that a lot of bad things come with city life. A lot of good things come, but there were a lot of bad things that were contrary to the pastoral kind of life of the early Hebrew people. And so, anyways, building a city and building a tower, he thinks that the image or the idea connection with Babylon was from the literature and not actually seeing the ziggurats. Makes a good argument, but it probably has something important for us there. Anyway, we have in literature a place where the Greeks saw and described the ziggurats, the really big ones of Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th and 7th century before the Common Era, and they could not have been known to the Yahwist and his sources back in the 10th century and before then. One of our authors. Now, okay, we're kind of there, and we're almost out of time, and before I can go on with another one or two things, but any questions about all of these things before we close? Yeah, Egypt, all of it. Right. All of these things, with the word studies that they do, like the Eber became Hebrew, they can do the linguistic studies and come back and see that these were early names of who became Egypt and Assyria and Lebanon and all of those countries that surrounded them. And actually, I've lost it in my notes, but one of the interesting things in all the genealogies, they never come down with Israel or the Hebrew people and their place. And one of the commentators was pointing out that this genealogy is unique and different from a lot of the genealogies that were found in the courts of the kings and the emperors, because most of their genealogies extolled their virtues and their powers, their abilities to conquer and subdue their enemies, and how special they were in their reign and realm, and they each had a manifest destiny to rule the known world. This one doesn't have any of that. And in one sense, it is so minimalist of who these people are that there is no sense that we are chosen because of our virtue. We are a special and unique people, an exceptional people. Now, one of the things that it kind of creates a problem for us in our Americana and our nationalism and our sense of exceptionalism, in that a lot of that comes from America, the United States, the land that was so rich